Iran, that they are the outliers in continuing to protect the Assad regime. He is going to go down. It is a matter of time. And as the Secretary has said, they really need to think about what side they want to be on when that happens, and about the positive humanitarian role they could play right now if they were willing to do the right thing.
And secondly, another part of this, and you've alluded to it, was the trying to encourage the opposition to get its act together. I'm wondering if coming out of this meeting, you have any confidence that that's in fact happening. We have reports today that there's a splinter group now that's developed, that's splitting away from the Syrian National Council, called the Syrian Patriotic Group, accusing the main body of not doing enough. So it seems as though after all these calls for unity, in fact, the opposition is emerging from this less unified than they were going in.
Well, I think the Syrian National Council did make a very strong showing at the Friends of the Syrian People conference, a very impassioned speech by President Ghalioun, which I would recommend to all of you. I think it's out there on the web for you to see. One of the, as I said at the beginning, one of the most important aspects of that speech was to make it clear that they want to see a Syria that represents all the groups and colors and histories and traditions in Syria as compared to Assad, who is ripping the country apart along ethnic and sectarian lines. So that was a very strong statement, which all of the countries at the Friends of the Syrian People applauded, and which is applauded in the conference statement, because it is so important that all of the Syrian opposition groups come together, work together on a common transition plan. That said, it is Assad and his violence that's making it difficult for the groups in different parts of Syria to work together, to communicate, to exchange ideas, to gather. As you know, we had hoped to have some opposition folks from inside Syria at the conference. That proved impossible for security reasons. Either they couldn't physically get out of the country because of Assad's violence, or they were afraid if they came out, they wouldn't be allowed back in. So he's doing everything he can to hamper a real, genuine, multi-ethnic dialogue about the way forward, and it is difficult. As you know, some of the folks from inside Syria were represented by video, which was the best that they could do. So, our goal is to continue to work with all of the groups that we've worked with, those outside of Syria, those inside of Syria, to help them to come together, even in the context of the very extreme and dangerous and violent circumstances that he's created.
Do you foresee a moment when, you've recognized the Syrian National Council as a legitimate representative of the Syrian people. Do you foresee a moment when they will be in a position either inclusive enough or have a broad enough representation of the people who are actually on the ground in Syria that they could be the structure which would be recognized as the legitimate representative of the Syrian people?
Well, again, I think that is up to the Syrian people. And at the moment, the vast majority of those who can speak to us from the Syrian National Council are resident outside of Syria. So we are supportive of their goal of trying to unify the groups. That said, there are very important groups in some of the major cities, some of the cities that are under the heaviest siege right now, and we want to ensure that they get a chance to speak their piece at the right moment about how they want to be represented in the future. Please.
Has the U.S. asked any Arab state to provide the Free Syrian Army with arms?
As we have said, Michelle, our goal is a political solution based along the lines that we've talked about.
But Secretary Clinton has agreed last week to provide the opposition with arms.
Pardon? I'm not sure what you're...
In Tunisia, we've read that she supported providing the Free Syrian Army with arms.
That's a false report. I don't know where you saw that, but that's not accurate. Please.
Has Ambassador Ford returned, and has he set up this special office here now to work with opposition figures?
He is now home. He is working in the NEA Bureau under the leadership of Assistant Secretary Feltman, and he is one of the lead players in the department in working through this strategy, both with our partners around the world, but also in an interagency context.
Is there any particular structure to this yet? You said he was going to be using social media a lot. Is there anything you can say
Yeah, no,
about
he
that?
has that. None of that has stopped. He's continuing his Facebook page, his Twitter page, his phone, and other contacts with all of the groups and individuals that he was working with in Syria. But he's just having to do that now from Washington rather than from the field. Yeah.
And one last question back to China and Russia. Is the Secretary calling her counterparts today, tomorrow, about...
We are continuing our diplomacy with China and Russia. Deputy Secretary Burns has spoken to his Russian counterpart. Undersecretary Sherman has spoken to her Chinese counterpart. We're obviously continuing our messages privately and publicly. Yes.
Are you more comfortable that the Syrian opposition is better defined, let's say, than its counterpart in Libya a year ago? That they are actually, they have a face, they have an address, and all that stuff?
Saeed, I think I spoke quite extensively to the challenges that they face, both that we had a strong showing by the Syrian National Council at the Tunisia conference, but they face challenges, and the opposition inside faces challenges coordinating among themselves because of the violence there. So this is a work in progress, let's put it that way, a work in progress. Brad?
Sorry. Can I ask why this wording about closing embassies, urging countries to close embassies, was included? When the United States closed this embassy, it was referred to strictly as a security concern, not as a punitive diplomatic measure against the Assad regime. And you also spoke at length in previous months about the value of having diplomatic representation in Syria, and now we're hearing from the Tunis meeting that all countries are urged to end that diplomatic representation.
Well, the way the Friends of the Syrian People communique is crafted, it says to reduce diplomatic ties with the Syrian regime and consider whether to close embassies and consulates. Brad, this reflects the fact that in some cases, some of the remaining diplomatic missions, and I'm not going to get into the who and the what, are playing a useful role on the ground in terms of being eyes and ears and support for the humanitarian effort, for the effort to coordinate and strengthen the opposition in working on its transition plans. But in many other cases, as you know, embassies have been closed, including from the Arab League countries, as a political statement of concern, of disgust with the situation. So the communique was designed to give different regional organizations in different countries a continuum of choices in how to put the pressure on, and not to close missions that might be helpful for the other goals that the Friends of the Syrian People are trying to advance, but where it is appropriate and possible to make a political statement to do so.
So, for example, the Polish embassy right now is playing an important role for the United States. You wouldn't want that to close necessarily today.
Correct. They're playing a very important role, including in trying to help us get to Homs so we can retrieve the remains of our deceased journalist and the others who are imperiled there.
Just return to this notion of the continuum of choices, and then back to the arms question that Michelle raised. Well, the Secretary didn't obviously publicly support this. Several of the key players did, including the Saudis and the Qataris, and they continue to say that this is a legitimate option that should be considered, arming the opposition. Do you emerge from this meeting with the sense that each country will set its own national policy on potentially arming the rebels, and that that's okay within the broader Friends of Syria framework?
Well, I think you can see that there is a continuum of views within the group on the right course here. As we have said, our view is that a political solution and immediate silencing of the guns is the best option. The concern, and the Secretary has talked about this, she talked about it in her press surveil in Tunis, she's also talked about it in some of the interviews, is that we could fuel an increasing spiral of violence here, and that's not good for the people of Syria and the long-suffering people of Syria. So we're obviously consulting with a broad cross-section of countries. We're taking soundings on what countries think the right answer is. But, you know, the Secretary did make the point over the weekend in some of the interviews that she gave that, this is one of the most capable, most deadly militaries in the world. And the opposition, to the extent that it's taking up arms in self-defense, is confronting tanks and heavy artillery and a massive machine with, essentially guns and much lesser armament. So there is a question what the right answer is in terms of trying to get to a peaceful democratic transition, which we all want, and not making it worse and not adding to the bloodshed.
And if we just to wrap this one up, last week you said that you would leave other potential options on the table. Nothing ever goes off, but you might have to consider additional measures, which was widely interpreted as leaving the door open to a potential future decision on arming the rebels. Is that door open still?
Beyond saying what we've been saying all along for a week and a half from this podium, that we don't take anything off the table, and that if he doesn't heed the will of his own people and the increasingly loud and strong voice of the international community, that we may have to consider additional measures. I don't have anything further to give you on that, Andy. Yes, Samir.
The Secretary focused the importance should be on defections from the circle of the regime more than arming the opposition. Do you have a progress report how many people in the military or the close circle of Assad are leaving him?
Well, I'm not going to size this for you, Samir, but the Secretary did speak over the last week about the fact that we are seeing an escalating pace of military defections, including of higher-ranking people. We're also seeing some close allies and supporters moving their money out of the country, moving their family members out of the country, clearly not a vote of support for the Assad regime and its staying power. Please.
On the embassy,
Yes.
there are no plans to close the Syrian embassy in Washington.
There are not. In the back, please.
There is some U.S. officials also have the concern that right now there is no appropriate successor for Mr. Assad. So maybe the ouster of the regime may lead Syria to more chaos. What are your concerns? What are your comments about that?
Well, as you know, for many weeks now, we have supported the Arab League plan, which has a very specific roadmap for how a unified national conversation about a transition could go forward. That same roadmap was endorsed by the 60 countries at the Friends of the Syrian People meeting in Tunis. It was also endorsed by the 137 countries at the UN General Assembly a week and a half ago. But the first step is that the violence has to end. Please.
Different topic.
Please.
On the U.S. DPRK talks in Beijing.
Yes.
Can you confirm media reports that the North Koreans said that they suspend uranium enrichment activities if the U.S. increases the amount of food aid and also increase grain in the aid package? Do you have anything on that?
Well, I'm not going to get into the details of the conversation that Glenn Davies had with his DPRK counterpart last week, beyond echoing what he said at the time, which was that this third round of bilateral talks was substantive, it was constructive. We did make some modest progress on the nuclear issue and on the issue of DPRK, ROK relations, both of which are absolutely vital if the DPRK wants to get back into six-party talks. As they always do, the North Korean side also raised the nutritional assistance. So we did discuss that. As you know, the United States does not link these issues. There's no deal to be had here. But we did continue to discuss the questions that the U.S. has with regard to need, with regard to how we might monitor nutritional assistance if we are to go forward with it. So no decisions have been made, either on the six-party talk side or on the nutritional assistance side. As you know, Glenn Davies is on his way back. He's also had consultations with the South Koreans, with the Chinese, with the Japanese. So he will come back and we will have a chance to consult with him here before we make any further moves forward. Thanks, sorry.
United States